We are thrilled that the guest of today's Live Sport Daily episode is the British ambassador here in the Czech Republic, Mr. Mattem Fieldem. Mr. Ambassador, welcome and thank you for joining our podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
First of all, I've always wanted to have a conversation about sports with you. Do you have actually time to even watch sports during your busy schedule, during a busy calendar?
It's a good question. Not lots of time, to be honest. I mean, the job is pretty full on, but I do try to make time. And just sometimes I find a way of my job giving me an excuse to watch sport, which is always perfect.
Okay. And what are the sports you actually follow the most?
So certainly rugby. Rugby's been a game I've been passionate about for a long time. That's the number one? I think that's probably number one. I've always watched, though, a lot of football, so I have a home team that I support. But especially coming out of the Olympics just recently, frankly, I've watched all kinds of things.
Yeah?
And that's one of the things that I love about the Olympics. You watch exactly those sports that you don't normally get excited about, and suddenly you get very interested in gymnastics or diving or something completely different, but that's part of the fun of the Olympics.
Was it always be the routine during Olympics or just now for the Paris?
I think particularly during the Olympics. I think all of the Olympics.
Okay.
But the Paris games were really good. I mean, nearly as good as London.
Yeah, absolutely. The topic of the discussion today is the connection between sport and the diplomacy. But first of all, I found out really interesting thing about you. I'm really curious about this question because I found out that you've been a member of an organizational committee of the World Cup in 2002 in Japan and in South Korea. I have to ask, how did that happen?
Yeah, sure. It seems quite a long time ago now. But so after I graduated from university, I moved to Japan and I worked in Japan for a couple of years. So I was a teacher and I was a rugby coach, and I fell in love with the country. An amazing country, fascinating, interesting, really quite challenging as well. Started to learn Japanese, started to learn a bit more about it. And then I came back to the UK and I was studying Japanese and for a master's. And a friend of mine, someone I'd met during my time in Japan, got in touch and said, look, we've got the World Cup coming up. She was a Brit, but working for the organising committee. And they were looking for people who spoke some Japanese who might be interested in coming across for a couple of months. So she invited me to come and run one of their ticketing offices, one of their venues in Sendai, in the north of Japan. And it was just too good an opportunity to miss. So I jumped on it and had a brilliant time there.
How was it?
It was amazing. Major sports events like that, there's a lot of attention on that country, a lot of visitors, of course. As hosts, they want it to go as well as possible. But for Japan, I think in particular, because it's not a country that many people know very well, it was even more important a moment for them. So it was a real spotlight on the country, Japan and the other host in South Korea. But it was a great time to be there, and I think people who came had a fantastic experience, and I tried to play my part in making them feel as welcome as possible.
You actually attended some of the games?
Yeah, so I was. I saw a couple of the games up in Sendai, and then, and this is where it's luck and being in the right place at the right time. But I got to see the final as well. So I went to see the Brazil-Germany game.
Yeah. The Ronaldo show. Yeah.
Yes, and I will admit I did buy a Brazil top on my way to the stadium so that I could support.
So you picked the right side.
I picked the right side, definitely.
So you have a personal experience with this kind of like a major sport tournament. Is there anything that actually you used later in your diplomatic career based on the fact that you've seen how gigantic it might be, like right on the place?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think it's maybe luck, maybe a little bit by design. So I've been in different places. So I was in, for example, Brazil during the Olympics and the World Cup, so 2014, 2016. Of course, I was in London in 2012. I was also, of course, here in the Czech Republic during the Ice Hockey World Championships. So it looks as though sometimes I've made my choices based on the sports events that I'm following around. But really what I've been doing is just being open to these opportunities and to really try to take that chance to help the country be successful. So there's often a partnership element. So because we went from the London Olympics to the Brazil Olympics in Rio, we did a lot of work actually as diplomats and as an embassy to support that cooperation, commercial opportunities, things like that, sharing our lessons. Even to the point that the basketball stadium in Rio was the London 2012 basketball stadium that had been designed to be collapsed, taken down, moved to Brazil and then put back up again, which I thought was fantastic. So, a good example of that sort of cooperation that we have. And moments like that are really important to those hosts. So it's a great privilege to be there and to enjoy them and to see as many people as possible coming to participate.
Well, based on that, would you say that maybe a role of sports in general on a global scale, it has such a more power right now? Like the influence is even more there. Would you say it's the same for diplomatic ties between the countries? That the sport plays a bigger role in it?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think, for example, you have this idea of soft power. So soft power is basically when money and military are not involved. Yeah, so soft power is the other stuff, the culture, the other things that create essentially sort of an attractive quality. So it helps to bring people towards your country. So soft power is absolutely connected with sport. So what we tried to do with London during the Olympics was to use this as a moment to improve all our relationships around the world, to increase our influence, to make the UK more attractive. And I think it really succeeded in that respect. I think Brits can be sometimes a little negative. We're not the only ones. But in advance
You're not.
in advance of the Olympics, I mean, it's strange to think now, but a lot of British people thought it was going to be, just a disaster. Bad organisation, bad events, people wouldn't be interested. But actually, it was really well organised and a fantastic atmosphere. And I remember being in London and genuinely the mood just of the whole city felt different during that time. So you have a real opportunity with those moments. And of course, sport is one thing that really is global. So in many cases, if you ask people to name someone from a country, they will tell you the name of a sports person. If you ask for them for their impressions about a country that they don't know well, they'll probably think about it in terms of sport. Yeah. So sport often gives us a first kind of connection, and that's very true in diplomacy as well.
Or was it also the first kind of connection you've had with the Czech Republic, actually? Maybe there are actually, I would say, two things: the beer, obviously, and then the ice hockey, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's true. But even before that, so if you'd asked me a few years ago to name 5 Czechs, I probably would have given you 3 footballers.
Yes.
And that again is part of the way that football, in particular in the UK, is a global game. And many of the majority of players in the Premiership are not English; they're not British. They come from around the world. So if you ask people even now to name Czechs, they probably would give you some of the names of either male or female footballers. And I think that is a really helpful kind of shorthand. What I then experienced when I came here, of course, is that's another opportunity to forge some connections. So not least in May last year, when we had the final of the UEFA Conference League here in Prague, and you had an English team playing in it, but that English team also had Czech players playing in it.
Yes.
And so the connections are pretty strong in both directions.
Does it make it your job easier, actually? These, obviously, it's like a consequence, but these connections, because you just mentioned Czech names, Tomáš Souček and Vladimír Soufal as members of the West Ham, does it make actually, the initial maybe discussion with your partners on the
I think it gives you opportunities, definitely. I think it gives people opportunities, and the fact that West Ham were playing here.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but this might be seen as the example of the soft power. How actually, for example, the fact that the Premier League is such a worldwide phenomenon, it doesn't make your job harder.
No, I think that's true. It does give you that sort of instant connection. That is definitely true, and it's a globally supported league. And of course, there's commercial opportunities that come with that as well. So it's a very successful commercial side to it as well. But when you think about a moment like West Ham coming, of course, that's exciting and a big opportunity, but that also means 25,000 West Ham fans coming. And for us as an embassy, that then presents some kind of risks and headaches, and not all of them are perfectly well behaved. The same as for the Italian fans as well. And so what you're trying to do is, as an embassy, is to kind of manage those risks as well as look for those positive opportunities. And I'm pleased that the great majority of fans that came had a great time, drank a lot, celebrated a lot, and went home with a really positive impression about
and the result was good as well.
And the result worked out well.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. In terms of like going back to the fact how the sport is actually seen overall globally, do you think that this trend will actually continue? That the importance of major sport events, or just leagues, or because, for example, some clubs are right now owned by states. They actually they are going really big into major sport leagues. Do you think this trend will continue? Yeah,
so I think, it's not hard to see that it's been on a positive trajectory for some time, and that looks as though it will continue. So football, but plenty of other sports as well. There's big money involved. That creates big opportunities. Also maybe some pressures, and sometimes you see a bit of a gap developing between that sort of top level of professional sport and the more grassroots level. So what we're trying to do in the UK is make sure that we're encouraging as many people as possible to participate, not just to watch sport, but actually to be physically active, especially young people. So that's part of trying to build on that success. Yes, support the teams, but also find ways of participating, and I've always enjoyed doing that myself as well. I don't get to play football or rugby as much as I'd like to, but it's still part of enjoying the game. And there are also parts of sport that I think have real opportunity for more growth. So you look at something like women's sport, and I think there's an enormous room for growth there, not least because it's not always been given as much time and attention. But whether it's football, rugby, basketball, other sports as well, you're starting to see appreciation of the women's game really grow as well. And that's fantastic for the women's game itself, brings more money in, brings more interest in it, but also encourages people in terms of participation, and young women and girls themselves to participate.
In terms of actually attract young people to participate and actually do physically the sport, I think that the best what you can do, especially in our country, in the Czech Republic right now, was the success of the men's hockey team.
Absolutely.
Were you actually surprised by the fact how much the Czech people are in love with the fact that every year in May there is a 2-week period where basically the whole country believes in the best?
Yeah, so look, I've seen the way that a country can go sports crazy during a major tournament.
I don't doubt that. Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the degree to which that was true. So this was the most, in terms of attendance, this was the most successful men's ice hockey championship ever. I think it beat the previous record, which was probably another Czech.
It was Prague 2015.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that in itself, not so much of a surprise. But what was great was coming along to games and actually feeling the atmosphere in the room itself, in the stadiums. Particularly here in Prague. So I went along and I supported Team GB when they were playing against the Czechs. Wasn't so successful for us. Maybe we don't have the same ice hockey tradition, but actually they did pretty well, and I think it was a very respectable performance. And they're very well supported, not huge numbers of fans, but really dedicated. But the atmosphere generally through the whole tournament was great. And of course, when the hosts do well, the tournament tends to continue that buzz and that enthusiasm. But it was a really great atmosphere, and it was great to see that outside the stadium as well as inside it.
Was it actually sports in terms of like the Czech society? Was it maybe a thing that when you for the first time ever came to Prague as the British ambassador, to think to reach out to Czech citizens through sports? Actually, that I would say it works pretty well, because obviously you and your team created this funny ice hockey video, for example, before it, and the reach and how the people actually appreciate the fact that you are part of the Czech sport tradition. It works.
Yeah, I think so. I think if it's done in a way that is not too self-important. So what we're trying to do, for example, the ice hockey. I played a lot of field hockey, but I've never played ice hockey. Don't really skate, so. There was no way I was going to pretend to be an expert.
You prefer tea on the bench. Yeah.
So we had to find a way to play with that rather than pretending that I'm some sort of expert on the sport, which clearly I'm not. But it does show an appreciation. I think most of us like to have that appreciation for what we're doing at home. And when someone comes in who, as I am as a guest, as a visitor to this country, and shows an interest in that, I think if you do it in that way without being too self-important, and with a little bit of wit or humour as well, I think that's always a good way to connect with people.
Did it work also with the fact that there was a Petr Bříza was involved in the video? That obviously it wasn't not only about obviously yourself, but the American and Canadian ambassadors.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. And our first thought was the American and Canadian ambassadors, not least because they're good friends, they're great colleagues, they're both brilliant at what they do. But also those are two countries that have great traditions, especially the Canadians when it comes to ice hockey. I think Ambassador McLaughlin was probably a little disappointed. The expectation for the Canadians generally is to win pretty much every ice hockey tournament that they enter. So probably a little bit disappointed. But they also had a fantastic time. And you could see from the response of the Canadians who came during the championships what a great atmosphere it was and how much they enjoyed it.
I'll just go back for the question when we discussed West Ham and the players over there, because not only the players are involved, there is also obviously the shareholder Daniel Křetínský. I just wanted to ask if on the business level, if it's actually this is also helpful, that they not obviously historically, but at the moment the ties between these two countries are just naturally good, so the work is then might be easier.
It definitely helps. Look, one of my jobs as the ambassador here, and it's true for the embassy as well, is that we're trying to encourage more business between our two countries. So investments in both directions are always welcome. Investing in a football club, it's a business choice. Of course, it's also often comes down to things that people are passionate about the game, so they care about the game, and that's why they get interested in investing in a football club. But more broadly, we have a lot of Czech investments into the UK and other areas as well, and British investments here. And that's something we want to continue and to encourage. So football can be a good way into that. That's definitely true.
And except football, are there any other sports in general where do you see there might be this kind of connection?
So I think
these kind of, because football is obviously number one.
Sure. In terms of business, because of the scale of football, that often dominates. But you also look at the history of cooperation in other areas. So something like rugby, which is not a professional sport in this country, you can see a great tradition of contact between British rugby and rugby here in the Czech Republic, and that's something that supported, really encouraged, and when we've got the opportunity to bring people through here and to support the grassroots rugby here, I was really pleased to go and visit some of the rugby clubs here. What I especially like is that there's a really positive, inclusive atmosphere when it comes to children. So kids in the sport, boys and girls, and that's something that we try to do in the UK and that we would encourage as well here. But you look at other sports where we don't have that same tradition. Ice hockey, for example, you're probably looking at more of an influence the other way, where Czechs coming into the UK, and there's someone who does a really interesting thing in this respect, who's Petr Cech.
I know, yeah.
Of course, Petr Cech, everyone knows as a Chelsea footballer, but is now an influential voice in British ice hockey, having sort of hung up his boots, he's picked up his skates, and he's been very successful because he's played previously at such a good standard. So, he's helping us understand ice hockey a bit better, I think, and that's an example of it going in both directions.
Did you have the chance to meet him actually and have this discussion maybe about this as well?
I did meet him a couple of times, and he was everything that I'd hoped he would be. He has a great reputation in the game in the UK. He's always been a very smart, fantastic player, but also very eloquent, very thoughtful about the game, and with kind of a wider set of interests. And you can see that that was immediately obvious in the conversation with him. So it was great to be able to spend some time and to get to know him a bit, but he lived up to his reputation. Yeah,
now I'm thinking about it, he did a lot for the propagation of the game of the ice hockey in your country.
I think so. And also, as an ambassador for your country in the UK, another brilliant job as well. One of the very best, arguably, certainly probably top 3 goalkeepers to play in the Premiership, and hugely respected. and then also for the way that he has behaved off the pitch as well. You know, a great ambassador for this country.
In terms of the authenticity you have on the social media and how you actually work and actually involve sports in your work as a diplomat, is it the part of your job that you actually enjoy the most? Because I would say so, but correct me if I'm wrong. That this is something.
So I'm very lucky in that there's a lot of things that I enjoy that I get to do in connection with my job. So sport is part of that. It definitely is. It's hard to pick just one thing that's the best thing about my job, because there are so many great things about my job. But it is definitely one of those. For example, we recently had a visit by the international cricket authorities who were coming for a meeting with the Czech cricket body, and that was this is not a big sport. It's often played by people of either British or South Asian or Australian, South African background, but there are also Czechs playing the game, and it was a nice way to see that. And it again comes back to this idea of soft power. So there are games that we've helped share with the world, may have started in the UK, but we certainly don't own them anymore, and that's definitely true of football, it's true of golf. Tennis is another good example, where Czechs, especially Czech female players, seem to be very successful, particularly at Wimbledon. So we've had champions the last few years, and that's great. That's part of something that we've shared with the world, but then it's being brought back to us and played at a much higher standard, arguably, than we're playing ourselves. So this is a good way of doing diplomacy. It's not the only way. There's other things that we do as well, and we're lucky to have that also. But sport, it definitely helps with my job.
I also wanted to thank you, because from the moment you became the ambassador, the Czechs are extremely successful in all sport events and tournaments.
I don't want to argue with the statistics, but since I started, I don't think the Czech Republic has lost a world championship in the ice hockey, for example. This is clearly a good run so far. And Wimbledon has been...
Wimbledon, that was my mind.
Female players at Wimbledon, it's been a great run. So I hope that doesn't create too much pressure for future years as well.
Oh, it does. But just quickly to the Wimbledon thing, is it also like... it extremely improves the way of thinking about Czechs in the UK, not only from the perspective, because sometimes I would say it might be tricky that people only thinking about a sports event, but I would say that it improves the reputation of the whole country, because the people just connected to one person, Peter Čech, and Czech tennis players, that they will actually see the whole country, and it's somehow better, even though it's not true. But the thinking might be in this way.
I think that's true, and I think you can see that even in other sports and moments like the Olympics. So it's not just a moment for the hosts to showcase what they're doing. It's also an opportunity for other countries, and for many of us, the main time we will think about those countries will be during a major sports event like that. So you absolutely have those moments, and it does create opportunities to change perceptions. I think it also depends a bit on the quality of the individuals as well.
Right.
So some people are even better maybe at sort of representing and being a voice and a representative of the country. And I've been really impressed actually with the way that Czechs have been doing that. Czech athletes have been doing that for this country. I think it's a brilliant resource and an opportunity. And you can see that not only with the tennis, but also in other areas as well. It's very positive.
Is there anything what you would like to see from the sport on the top level globally? What you would like to see them to do more, like encouraging people doing something, like young people, for example?
So I think one of the things that I often think is, and we've mentioned it already, but participation is incredibly important. And many of our countries are facing challenges with kids being less active than they would have in the past. And so participation in sports, I think, is really important, not only for those people who will go on to be successful athletes themselves, but for everyone else that can find a way to participate. So whatever that might be, to find ways to be active, and then to stay active in later life as well. So, there's huge opportunities that come from that. Sport can be a great way of bringing people together. I'm looking forward to next month going along to a football tournament that's we've helped to support, which is focused on Roma community children, and that's a way of interacting with them, bringing together and helping strengthen the community ties there. Again, not with a target of particularly about the professional level of sport, although that might happen as well, but it's also about the opportunity just to build community links and strengthen that sense of self-worth as well, individuals.
Yeah.
And it can be very, very positive. I worry a little bit sometimes. I've seen, because the games can get quite serious. Parents can get quite serious about the game because there's often a lot at stake if someone shows promise early on. The risk is that you take some of the joy out of the game. And I've seen, for example, in the UK, they've had to bring in some cases, sort of codes of conduct or standards of behaviour for parents and how they're expected to behave.
Oh, it's a huge problem right now.
How kids are expected to behave, particularly towards referees. In football, so we've seen that as well, that sometimes they copy the worst bits of the professional game. Those are things that you have to work on, but I think still the goal of getting as many people participating as possible is the right goal.
And maybe a kind of an advice to younger people from yourself. Is there anything from sport or from your passion for sport that you actually use every day in your job, or what helped you the most in your profession?
Yeah, so I loved team sports growing up. So rugby, particularly field hockey, and then much more casually playing football as well. I think the point about playing in teams and the need to be able to think in terms of team rather than just individual performance, I think that's a really valuable lesson. Very few of us achieve anything by ourselves completely. Almost everything in a professional, personal life is about working, cooperating with others. And I think that's where team sports can be a really positive experience. I do think there are lessons there still that I keep thinking of, and it's one of the reasons actually that I like rugby so much, is that there's a culture in rugby. It might surprise people, especially those that don't know the game well. It looks a very violent game, and in some ways it is. In some ways the violence is on the pitch, but actually there's an awful lot of self-control and
respect to each other
and respect.
Yeah.
And you can see that in interactions with the referee and the way that people treat each other, especially after the game has finished, which I think is a really positive influence. So it's another of the reasons why I always love to see kids that are excited about playing the game. But really, it's about finding whatever sport or activity is going to work for you. So you've got great traditions in this country of climbers like Adam Ondra at the Olympics, people who have really excelled in different kinds of areas. The main thing is that just young people find something they're enthusiastic about, that they enjoy, and they really get themselves into it.
So one would say that the top level of the sport would need more of a rugby manners.
Well, I think... Although what's interesting to me is the more I watch the women's game, the more I think that the women's game sets a standard which I would love to see more of in the men's game in football, for example. So the England team has been quite successful recently, particularly the female team, the Lionesses, winning the European Championships recently. A lot of people, as they started to watch that team because it was being successful, would point out, there's a bit less diving in this game.
Yeah.
There's a bit less rolling around on the floor pretending to be hurt. There's a little bit less arguing with the referee. And actually they enjoyed that. So they like that side of the game. I think there's something to learn there for the men's game also.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your time and for this amazing interview. Thank you.
That's all. Thank you.